Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
Wow. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised that Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Na Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And we're joined today by Shannon Foley Martinez, who is a consultant with Peril. Shannon, it sounds like a supervillain organization. What does it mean?
It stands for the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. So part of the thought behind it is that, that there's academic research that we need, but so often by the time that academic research is peer reviewed and comes out, that it's not relevant anymore to what the landscape actually looks like. So this is focused on a, learn by doing approach. Like, let's put what we believe to be best practices in place and then practice them and then learn through success and failures as we go.
So at Peril, you're looking at things like youth polarization and extremist radicalization. I guess maybe you could give us where your expertise in that comes from.
Sure. So from when I was 15 until I was about 20 years old, I was a neo-Nazi white supremacist skinhead. I'm 46 years old now, so I've been out of the movement for over 25 years. And I also, during those 25 years after I left, have had 7 kids. So my adulthood has been spent, how do you raise children who will never look to hate or violence as an expression or an answer to anything that comes their way through life. So, and I also, because my past is my past, that I have lots of people who reach out to me who are trying to leave these worldviews, leave these spaces, and also families who are deeply concerned, working with teachers and local agencies and training, even like law enforcement, trying to be like, you have to identify the white supremacists in your departments and get rid of them. Like that is a very crucial step to dealing with what we're seeing here. It has to be not unclear whose side you are on. And so that's where my, my whole jam comes from.
Is having children, was that part of your process of creating a new life for yourself after you left the movement? And what were the circumstances that made you feel like you wanted to leave?
The idea of having 7 kids and it being part of a plan is ridiculous. I'm just like, I'm the world's worst contraceptor. I've even gotten pregnant after having surgery to not have any more babies. So that was it was not part of a plan, but as it has happened, my oldest is about to be 23. As it has happened that, trying to become a healed, whole, and, non-dysfunctional person to be able to raise children who thrive and are emotionally well and healthy, that has turned out to be a huge part of my healing and the motivation to continue to heal and identify spaces that still need work in myself and to model being a transparent work in progress, which I think actually turns out to be really important for kids to see the adults in their life, be able to say, I'm a work in progress. I actually don't know what I'm doing, and clearly what I did has hurt you. I'm sorry. Let's figure out a way to move forward better. I actually think that that's really an essential thing that kids need as they mature into adulthood. But when I left, I ended up moving, because I moved all over the place while I was still part of the white power movement. And I ended up at one point not really having anywhere to go. And I was taken in by the mom of a guy that I was dating, who was also a white supremacist and who happened to be in the Army. So, like, totally not a new problem at all. Probably like 30 of my contacts while I was in were all military. But she took me in and let me live with her and her 3 younger sons. And in essence, because my stuff was all before the internet, so the echo chamber that I lived in was like a physical echo chamber. When I moved into that house, I essentially, my echo chamber got, really kind of like busted up. So like every day, all day, wasn't just only around other people who were spewing this ideology all the time. At the same time, my life began to be filled with other things that, she had 2 11-year-old twin boys and a 9-year-old son at the time when I lived there. And so, like, I started, doing stuff like fishing and camping and throwing the football in the backyard and helping around the house and, starting to, like, put things back into my life where they hadn't been. And I don't, it'd be much better storytelling if there was like a single, like, aha, like, I'm out. But it wasn't like that. It was probably like over the course of probably about 4 or 5 months or so, where as my life was being filled with other things, and I had this place, in this family where they had, there was no reason for them to take me in. They just did and let me be part of that family. It wasn't, like I had to like help around the house and stuff, but there wasn't, that it was the closest thing to unconditional acceptance and love that I had probably ever experienced in my life at that point. And in that environment, that my ideology began to fade away. And I think I realized probably about 4 or 5 months after living there, like, I don't believe any of this stuff that I was doing. And I really have to figure out what to do and how to move my life forward, and and began to take some steps to do so. So it was like in that environment where that disengagement began to happen, and I started to think in terms of future again, like where do I want to go? What do I want to do with my life? Because while I was in, everything was very hyper present, that I was living a very violent life. Most of my relationships while I was in were violent, that there was always fights and all, lots of violence that I was immersed in. And so I didn't think of future, like personal future, in any way other than what could I do in terms of the movement or whatever. But my personal future had just completely fallen away. So I began to take steps to think about that. But I will also say that, so a lot of times stories like mine get told and it's said like, oh, well, it's like with empathy and compassion, like that's, that's how people are able to leave these worldviews. And, and it's so much more complicated than that. Like, to me, number one, it's irresponsible, especially to like my former like targets and victims of my violence, put the impetus on them to have like love and empathy out, anyone from any kind of like hate or violence based worldview. Like, to me, I'm just like, that's like asking an abuse victim to just love and empathy the abuse out of their abuser. So I think that's I think it's far more complicated than that. What did happen, though, was that I not only dehumanized other people, but in the process of doing that I myself became dehumanized. Like, I became less than human myself. That all of the empathy that I had, because as a kid, I was hyper empathetic. I was actually like very like anti-apartheid and really like cared about injustice amongst my friends and in school and stuff like that. And then while I was in involved with all this stuff, my empathy got completely turned inward. So that it included like myself, the immediate group of people that I was around, and by extension, sort of like the white race, like who the perceived in-group that I had. All of my empathy was turned inward. And when I was living in that household, and I believe that because that empathy is completely like turned inward, that empathy is really what makes us human, that our ability to empathize and feel the pain and struggles and even joys and triumphs of other people, that's really a fundamentally innate part of humanness. And while I was living in that household, that process began to be reversed. So I began to be rehumanized, where my empathy was now expanding back outward to a world greater than just myself. But I will also say that it wasn't just like I woke up one day and everything was great. Like, I was still a mess. Part of my story, like ending up in all of this stuff, was that I grew up in a really dysfunctional household, and there was sexual assault, when I was 14 years old, and that was like completely unprocessed. And, so it was like, as I was leaving and I was disengaging from all of this stuff when I was, 20 years old, that stuff was still there and still unprocessed. And I still didn't even know that I needed to address any of it or, gain better skills and tools. So I was still a mess of a human being for a long, long, long time. That my life was, I was no longer immersed in hate and violence, but my relationships were all really dysfunctional, and I did not have good, emotional skills and tools. And when my oldest son was born when I was 23 years old, that for me, that was a point where I was like, okay, I really have to figure out how to learn some of these skills so that when I had never even changed a baby's diaper when he was born. I only knew that I didn't want to raise my kids the way I had been raised, and that I never wanted them to be me. Like, I never wanted them to be like me. And so that began really like my intense journey of trying to heal. And I don't think it was until around that time either that I really began to reflect upon. So, a 3 to 4 year gap to really reflect on like, well, how did I end up in a white power movement? Like, how did that even happen? What was going on for me that even made that something that was possible? And coming to terms with, it wasn't just like a period of my life or whatever, but that I actually hurt and harmed other human beings, coming to that stark realization so that I could begin the process of healing and get to the point of trying to make lifelong, ongoing, meaningful amends.
How did you go about starting to make those amends? Like, I can't imagine that would have made you very popular with some of your former comrades. For me, it was before the internet. So all of my stuff happened in a physical space. And at some point, I ended up moving out of the house where I had been living with this mom and her kids, and went back to school and went to college. I never ended up graduating. So in the interim between leaving and having my oldest son, I actually had 2 other babies that I gave up for adoption. Again, like my life was a disaster. I was not a very put together young woman. So when my oldest son, when I was pregnant with him, I was like, okay, like I can't, like the heartbreak of considering like giving another baby up for adoption just like crushed me. Like I was just like, I can't. And so luckily his dad was just like, okay, well, we could try it, I was like, okay. And that was like all I needed to hear was like, let's just try to be a family. At that point, like I was so physically distant, and I was like not even part of any of the movement or I didn't associate with any of the people that I had formerly been around. So it wasn't like there was an immediate threat to my life, or, I didn't feel like a sense of danger
in that way. One of the things I do think that, borrowing some of the ideas around like 12-step programs of recovery for drugs and alcohol and stuff like that are useful here, that like part of the process, and I think a lot of people who leave want to skip over this part of the process. That part of the process is like coming to understand the nature of the wrongs that I had done, and like that coming to real terms with like, wow, like I really, I hurt other people, and talking to other people about the things that I had done. And, when it began, it was just people really in my close, like intimate circle of family and friends talking about like this part of, hey, this was like part of my life or whatever. Through doing that and sharing really the worst things that I've ever done and the worst things that were done to me, people felt safe to share their worst things back with me. And so that became just sort of a modus operandi for me to live like really just transparently imperfect and share my struggles and share bad parts of my life and who I was and had been and the mistakes that I would make. And then that just sort of expanded outwards. And as I was doing that like part of, another part of like 12-step programs is like to make direct amends where to do so doesn't cause more harm. Right. And so I think a lot of people that are coming, out of stuff like this, that is a part that they want to get right to the amends making. But if you don't do all of the other healing work first, that you are limited in your ability to really understand if you're going to actually do more harm than good with the amends that you're trying to make. And so for me, especially early on, that amends making really looked like community service for me. How do I get active in my local community and support people and organizations and give of my time and things like that?
You're listening to Pass Around on 3CR 8:55 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital on your DAB radio. We're currently talking to Shannon Foley Martinez, a former neo-Nazi who now helps people get out of the movement.
You've been helping people exit the movement or reconsider ideas for quite a few years now. What are the things you've found that have stayed the same, and what are the things, if anything, that's changed over the last 20 years?
So obviously, one of the biggest changes, of course, is the internet. Right. So that has definitely been a game changer. There's a thing called ACE scores. It's called Adverse Childhood Experiences. And there's a bunch of research around this. It's an ongoing body of research. And what this shows us is that the more traumatic experiences that children have, the more likely they are to have less than optimal outcomes of all different kinds. The more likely they are to be physically ill as adults, the more likely they are to go to prison, the more likely they are to be drug or alcohol addicts. So there's, so it's ACE scores of 4 or higher. There's like a short form that's 10 questions, and now they've expanded out to include more questions about, about your childhood experiences and stuff in some of these studies. If you have a score of 4 or higher, it's a direct correlation to all kinds of less than optimal outcomes. And I have come to view hate or violence-based worldviews as one of these less than optimal outcomes. So, it's the more trauma and the more bad things that happen to somebody that are piled on, as they pile on, the more likely they are to look to these less than optimal outcomes to either cope with their needs not being met, or to have the closest illusion that they are offered to feeling like these like basic sort of emotional needs are being met. For me, it was actually very unlikely that I would collide with this particular worldview or whatever, because it had to happen in a physical space. I had to meet another human or have a physical book or a physical record or CD put into my hand where these ideas were. I had to encounter them in real space. So it was actually very unlikely that I would collide with this and then take off down that trajectory. But now with the internet, that and like going, I speak and present at a lot of schools, everything from middle school up through university. And when I ask young people about their internet habits, and, it's like, are you on Twitch? Are you on, are you on TikTok? Are you, where are you at? And then ask them if they've encountered racist or anti-Semitic comments or content online. Every single hand goes up. Like, it's really close to 100% everywhere that I've gone. And of course, all the adults in the room are like, their jaws drop. They're like, no way that my middle schooler has like, and I'm just like, no, they totally have. One of the big game changers is that it's almost certain that people will collide with these ideas and with these worldviews. And, and so that is a humongous shift that has changed. One of the things that hasn't changed is that some of the things, also identified in some of the ACE score studies and some other areas of research are that there are things that we can do that better inoculate people against ever finding resonance. So like, even if there are traumatic events and things like divorce, parents divorce, parents, drug or alcohol addicts, not having meaningful connections, being bullied, all of these things that kind of sort of stack up or whatever, that there are also inoculating factors. People often use the term resiliency, but I have a lot of autistic folks in my life, and that they have said that they find the term resiliency to often be used in a sort of weaponized and ableist way. So instead, I have tried to use the term inoculating, that things like a meaningful relationship with unconditional positive regard from like one other adult in a child's life can help inoculate them against the likelihood of these like less than optimal outcomes or whatever. So the internet definitely is a game changer. I think one of the other game changers too is that life has changed a lot, and that there's economic factors that are real. Like in America, wages have remained pretty stagnant, whereas the cost of living has increased exponentially, and the percentage of income that's needed to go just for like transportation and housing and medical care and stuff like that has risen exponentially. So the adults are way more stressed out and not as present. Kids spend way more time at school. Like the school year's now like 180 days, which it was like way shorter when I was a kid. So I think like that is definitely a factor that, kids see way less of their parents, and not because parents are doing anything wrong. Like they're just trying to survive. Like there's no judgment here whatsoever. But in terms of just like things that have changed, like those are things that have changed. Job opportunities, the cost of education, the debt that people enter into adulthood with, the realities of looming climate catastrophe, things like that, I think are also things that have really changed, and that all of those things lead to a world in which young people, that they carry a lot of anxiety and stress and fear, and those are all things that if you don't have the skills and tools to be able to healthfully express and manage and cope with that anxiety and stress and fear, any of us who have ever been stressed out know that often does not lead to the best behavior that we know we have in us, right? Like, we're way more likely to, snap and yell at somebody or whatever when we're stressed out than if everything is like awesome and we feel, we feel really great. So I think that those are also things that are sort of like happening in the backdrop. And then I also think that there's something that is going on as well with the internet, where social change used to happen much more slowly and organically, where it would, start on especially in America, it would start on the coasts, California, New York City, and stuff like that, and it would begin to filter inward to the bigger cities in America. And maybe at that point, a cause or, social change that needed to happen would be championed by an influencer, by somebody making movies or a musician or an actor or actress, and that social change would then begin to be interjected into, media. And so by the time social change got to, like, say, this farmer in Iowa, the social change movement had a sense of cohesion. So, like, the terms would already have been hashed out, and there'd be basically agreed upon definitions. There'd be a basically agreed upon sort of agenda, and even, like, what change was being asked for. By the time it got to middle America, that it was kind of like, okay, here's the change that is being presented to you. With the internet, social change is now happening in real time. It's happening as we're watching it. And there is no cohesion, that there's a general sense of the social change that's being presented there, but we haven't agreed upon definitions and terms. Like, you can even if you just ask 5 different people what racism is, you're probably going to get 5 different answers. If you ask 5 people what intersectionality is, you're almost definitely going to get 5 different answers. If you ask people if one particular event is racist, you'll probably again get 5 different answers. That there's this real-time consciousness awakening or whatever that's happening. And I think that is causing a lot of unrest and and confusion and stuff too, that is part of what is happening right now too, that some of the real implicit parts of the status quo, and again, I can only really speak about America, but some of the power structures that are so innate in our country and its perpetuation, are being deeply, deeply challenged right now. And that is both obviously unsettling on a societal level, but I think also in, smaller personal level ways and community ways. Like, the way that we have done things is based on an unfair systems of oppression and perpetuated oppression. But we're kind of collectively at that point where I was at as I was leaving the white power movement, where it's like, but we're still a mess. Like, we still don't have the skills and tools to, like, move ahead functionally and healthfully and wholly and well. So I think that those are some of the, like, big key differences. I think another thing that has really, really shifted, like, you'll hear me talk about, like, I was part of the white power movement. And there is definitely a hard shift away from movementarianism, where there isn't some sort of, like, cohesive or even really easily identifiable movement in terms of fascist and fascist adjacent and white supremacist, movements. And then there's a definite shift to more like a worldview, and that's all overlapping with ideas of just bringing about societal collapse so that we can bring forth whatever comes next, like, accelerationist stuff, and that there isn't one cohesive worldview. Like, there isn't one cohesive end game at all, and lots of overlapping sort of like micro ideologies. And even the idea of it being an ideology, I think, is something that there's a big shift away from as well.
So that's all we've got time for. Thanks very much for joining us, Shannon. If people would like to find you online, where could they do so?
You can find me on Twitter, and you can find my website, which I think is, this is how bad I am at self-promotion, I don't even know my website, I think is ShannonMartinezSpeaks.com. So you can find me there if you have concerns or questions about a loved one, or, how to help your kids have, better skill set to be able to resist all this stuff. Please don't hesitate to reach out.
Well, that is all we had time for in our discussion with Shannon Foley Martinez, but there is more if you want to check out the podcast version of this show. You can either go to 3cr.org.au/passaran or check us out on Apple Podcasts. Just look us up. Global Intifada is up next. Catch you next week. Goodbye.
Going back to what you were saying before, Shannon, about, the kinds of people that are attracted to white power and involve themselves in the movement and the changes that have taken place over the last few decades. I guess one of the things that I've understood to have been happening in the US and elsewhere is there's also a kind of cohort of political activists, and I'm thinking of people like Richard Spencer and others who did, they may not be in that position today, but were exchanging the boots for suits and were presenting a very different, or trying to present a very different image of the kind of cultivated racist who's, well-read and well-dressed and polite and I guess presentable. And yet, at the same time, is still presenting very similar ideas and pursuing very similar goals to the neo-Nazi skinhead who does it in a much more kind of crude and direct fashion. So what's your understanding of this kind of, I guess, more middle class and establishment image that's being projected by segments of the white power movement in the United States?
And again, this is specific to the U.S. because this is not necessarily true in some of the places, in some other places where there are still ties to working class support that's tapped into. That I would say in the U.S. overwhelmingly, the people that we're talking about being at highest risk are actually middle class, upper middle class, and upper class. Mostly white kids and young adults. So when I think I left like around 1992, 91, 92. And during that time, that's when that shift actually began to really happen, that there was a lot more talk of like, hey, everybody, let's try to mainstream a little bit more. Let's, grow out our hair, join, the military, the police force, government jobs, teaching jobs. Let's be part of the community and create influence from inside. So that's been something that's been happening for quite a while. I will say in terms of, the alt-right and into the grouper sphere that, to me, the alt-right is just completely dead at this point, that they've largely accomplished. I mean, some of that was affected by Charlottesville and the aftermath of that and all the lawsuits and things like that happened. But they've also, because they really wanted this to be a political movement. They really wanted to have political legitimacy and have representation that way. But, and so they've all sort of fallen apart and have lost influence. However, I will say that most of the ideas that were being put forth and purported by those who were self-identified and also, identified as alt-right, that those have been largely been subsumed by mainstream conservatism at this point, that you will hear mainstream conservative politicians and influencers and stuff like that talking about conspiracy theories of, the Great Replacement and stuff like that, so that, on the one hand, they have functionally sort of fallen apart, and on the other hand, the ideas that they were putting out in terms of, sort of mainstreaming some of this stuff are really part of the mainstream here. You can turn on the news and you can probably hear some sort of conspiracy theory about, white supremacy or, some of the related and adjacent things that are out there in terms of, whether it's having to do with Black Americans or having to do with Jews or, or whatever. So there's that whole landscape of stuff. But I will also say that there is a whole other contingent of folks over the past at least decade that have arisen that want nothing to do with that iteration of any of these worldviews. And, and I'm thinking about in terms of Atomwaffen and the base and, whatever splinter groups they all splinter off into, and the rebranding and the new names and the all of that they have absolutely no desire to be part of the political process. In fact, like, electoralism is seen as antithetical to what the future state should be or whatever. And that as things socially continue to be in such upheaval here, that I believe that is the largest growing sort of contingent of these worldviews.
With fascism, you also find often anti-fascism. Do any of the people you speak to getting out of the movement or out of this lifestyle credit Antifa with helping them on that journey?
It's going to, it'll depend, right? Like, that there are definitely people who I have worked with who really amplified their commitment to trying to distance themselves and begin to build their life as a body of evidence of fundamental change out of the reality that there's a likelihood that they could be doxxed, and that their information and the posts that they've made and stuff will be made public. So in terms of some of that, yes. I don't, not so many in the way that I think that you're thinking, but I think looking back, as they gain distance, that they will see, like, oh, okay, like, these people that were instrumental in sort of reaching out and connecting me with resources often also had politics which align with, what we deem as Antifa.
You've been engaged in, I guess, what you might call de-radicalization or exit work for a while.
I've started calling it deprogramming because I see it more.
Oh, okay.
I see it kind of more like that. I don't know. I think radicalism gets a bad name. Like, I don't know. Like, I think that there's definitely, radicalism can be a really great thing. Like, what we're really talking about is in terms of, like, fascism and racism and violence and hate and things like that we, so, and because, especially with, when you're talking about some of the more, talking about, like, QAnon, and you're talking about some of the, like, esoteric Hitlerism stuff that's out there, that you're really talking more about sort of like cult mentalities and cultish behavior. So I've shifted my personal speech to talk more along the lines of, like, deprogramming. How do we reset your brain? How do we get new neural pathways fired? How do we entrench those neural pathways? How do we connect you with the things that will help you begin to attach your thoughts and life to things that aren't destructive and hurtful?
That's a very good point. But I guess to reframe the question, in terms of the deprogramming, what are the things that are missing from your work and that of others that you think, if were present, would really assist you in helping people leave the movement?
Money, for sure. At this point, I work 10 to 12 hour bartending shifts, most of the week. So I work, most of my time is spent, doing that. But yeah, so definitely funding. I think also one of the things that would be so much more helpful would be for people who are already set as support in communities to have better information about, for lack of ease of talking about it, but for what this, like, radicalization into hate and violence, like, looks like, what it entails, and some basic understanding and knowledge and information about how to support people as they're leaving that. So when I say that, I'm thinking about like educators, I'm thinking about social workers, I'm thinking about probation officers, psychologists, counselors, family counselors, that like thinking about the people who are already in support roles in the community who are most likely to encounter people who are exhibiting behaviors that are that are indicative that this is part of somebody's life and that they're in the process or already deeply entrenched on this trajectory, for them to have better familiarity with like what that looks like and like some of the things that can be done to help better off-ramp people, especially earlier on in their trajectory, when it's much easier to off-ramp people when they haven't invested so much of themselves, and their empathy is still easier to refocus outward. And then in terms of like when people have left, like helping, having that information in, community support structures already about, okay, like what are the things that are actually like helpful to help people, as they walk away and rebuild their lives. And, because like one of the things that I think is super overlooked is like, I will have a brain that is wired the way it is wired for the rest of my life. Like, I can't undo my childhood trauma. Now, there are things that I can do to help heal it. There are things like I can grow in awareness when I'm operating out of like a trauma response rather than, and I'm perceiving things around me as a threat, or I feel, that I'm responding in like in a disordered, stress and trauma response. But I'm always going to have a propensity towards trying to embrace simplistic, black and white, with clearly defined sorts of rules for negotiating life. I'm always going to have a propensity for wanting to attach to those things. And there's all kinds of ways. Obviously, there's like not everything is equally bad, right? Like somebody attaching to CrossFit and a keto diet as this way of like coping with their stress obviously is like far better than becoming a violent white supremacist or whatever. But I'm always going to have the propensity for wanting to grasp onto things that make simple the complexity of negotiating through the world. Because that's just, that's how my brain is. So it's something that I personally have to be vigilant about and recognize how I'm interacting with things. Even if those things are not harmful at all for other people, they could be for me. That if I am approaching religion and I am doing it from a standpoint of like, I need these really rigid rules for living so that I can adhere to them perfectly. Well, like, even though religion is, the practice of religion is a net good for so many people, practicing religion that way for me would not be a net good because I'm functionally utilizing it in the same way that I was utilizing hate and violence based, worldviews and stuff. And so getting some of that information and how that the healing from this isn't just like, I'm not posting, like I'm not shit posting anymore, or like I'm not sharing memes anymore or whatever. That it's like, that's step one. Like the disengagement process is step one. But for me personally, I'm like that. I don't feel like that's enough. Like I want everyone to thrive. I want everyone to gain healing and wholeness and wellness. And a lot of people when they leave think, oh, well, I'm done now. And it's like, well, no, you're done that part. But if you don't continue to examine and work on your healing, that there will just be other harm perpetuated, whether towards yourself or towards others, because you haven't really yet understood the sickness it is that you have. You only understood one of its symptoms. And so that for me, like getting that information to people and parents, like for me, I wish I could, talk to parents. Like this is like, we're not powerless. Like your kid doesn't have to grow up to be a 17-year-old that like murders, other protesters or walks into a church or a synagogue or a mosque and murders, dozens of people. Like there are things that we can do to much better inoculate our children against finding resonance with this stuff. Much, much better. But it does require that we don't externalize the threat and say like, oh, well, not my kid, not me, not my family. We have to say like, well, my kids are at risk for this. And what can I do to help better inoculate them? Because again, they will encounter these ideas and this material. And we just have to accept that as a fact. So if we want to actually, begin the journey of making sure that this doesn't become our children, then we have to first acknowledge like that this can become our children.